Conversaciones con Ciencia. Apasionados por las células. Las células son las protagonistas principales de la gran comedia de la vida. Dos científicos apasionados por las células nos explican qué les llevó a la biología y cómo descifran los secretos más íntimos de la vida en el laboratorio.
Elvan.
Hi, Van. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. So what are you up to these days?
Well, the usual. I'm running around like a headless chicken from the lab to the other lab, etc. How are you? What are you doing?
It's good. Things are also going busy in our hands, and lots of things are evolving in the lab. So there are very interesting things going on.
That's cool. How did you first get into this business?
So the business in terms of science, being a group leader.
Science.
So basically, I studied genetics because I was really impressed. My childhood favorite cartoon used to be Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Okay. And the second one was Spider-Man. So now looking backwards, I was just all my favorite things to do as a kid was just genetically modified organisms. Then I studied genetics. After that, as a just generic continuation, I just decided to do my PhD on genetics. And after that, I just moved on to do my PhD in cancer research. Then I switched fields to organization of a cell. And
did you ever consider doing medicine or interest with science?
I very briefly did, but I have a phobia of needles.
Yeah.
So that killed it basically. I was just okay, it might be interesting to do medicine, but I better not do medicine basically.
Yeah. I'm the same actually. I don't mind needles, but I don't like blood at all. So medicine was never an option.
Yeah. So how did you start? How did you decide to be a scientist? Or have you ever decided to be a scientist, or just evolved that way?
Yeah, a bit random actually. So when I was at school, I actually didn't like biology at all. Mm-hmm. And for the last 2 years of school, I wanted to change schools. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do maths, physics, economics, like that. But I was going to a school not where I lived, and they didn't have any places to do economics. Okay. And so I did biology just by default because it was the only subject I could do. Uh-huh. And then during the last 2 years of school, actually, I became interested in biology. So biology at school was all this sort of learning the names of things, etc., not quantitative. And then the last 2 years of school, it suddenly became molecular biology and DNA and proteins and stuff, and I became interested in it. And so if I hadn't changed schools, I don't think I would actually be here as a biologist now. Yeah.
So in my school, it was also very similar, actually. I didn't particularly like biology, although I was interested in genetics, because it was all memorizing names and this and that. It was really the teaching of biology really matters, how you teach biology as a wonder that happens around you, or is it just the Latin name of some boring vegetable?
Exactly. And also at school, biology or science, I thought all science at school wasn't really like how science is, because at school you always know the answers and it's like learning facts or how to do things. Whereas when you actually do science, you don't know the answers and it's all confusing and unknown. Exactly. And for me, it's actually much more like how other subjects were at school, like history or geography, where you do projects and you have to go and investigate things. That's actually what I liked much more at school, was this sort of open-ended
questions
subject.
and investigations.
Yeah,
exactly the same. Yeah.
And then even at university, I didn't know I was going to be a biologist, so I did science in general at university, natural sciences, and again, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do all the way through. But it's just as we did more and more biology, you just realise we know so little still about biology, about how it works, and there's just so many questions, and it's so easy to come up with things that we don't know about and important questions to answer.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's good fun. It's cool. So you did do a PhD in the UK.
Yeah.
But you didn't grow up in the UK.
No, I did not.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Turkey. Actually, I grew up in a town called Mersin, very close to Syrian border, but it's on the Mediterranean coast.
Oh, wow.
So I grew up in a very interesting place, at least when I was growing up. My mother used to go to Aleppo at the weekends to buy tablecloths and things.
Wow.
And now the Aleppo doesn't exist, basically. It was looking backwards, I think it was a special time of.
And were either of your parents scientists or academics?
No, they're not. My father is an engineer, and my mother is a physics teacher. And what about yours, actually? I have no idea.
My mum's a doctor, pediatrician, and my dad's a vet. So I always had this sort of aversion to biology when I was a kid because I didn't want to do what my parents did.
Exactly. It happens to lots of kids, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I always had lots of animals and lots of biology around, but I wasn't particularly interested in it as a kid.
So it is very interesting, right? Because when I wanted to study genetics, both of my parents were very much against it.
Yeah.
So they tried to respect me and my decisions, but they made it very clear they don't support it.
Why not? Because they wanted you to do something more of a career, or
more of a more practical thing. They wanted me to become a medical doctor or a pharmacist or just something more practical
like
in their eyes,
career.
not like an academic research scientist.
Yeah. So where did you, after you did your PhD? Where in the UK? Manchester?
In Manchester. Yeah. But I went to Boston, which was very nice in several ways. But at the very same time, even then, I wasn't comfortable with many American-style things.
Yeah.
So what I did was basically I did a short postdoc, and I grabbed the most American thing that I liked, which is my husband.
Yeah.
And then we moved to Barcelona together. And they both own our research laboratories, and I think also like in my field of research, like one thing that's really personally interested me, that's studying fertility, was that my mom gave birth to my only sibling, actually, like 12 years younger than me, and it was a like accidental pregnancy, but like then she was much older than the usual age.
Yeah.
And for some reason, my parents just decided to involve me in most of the pregnancy-related things. So for checkups, for routine things, for actually the scary parts.
Huh.
So when I was 12 to 13 years old, I had this very formative period of like knowing some things are not known. Like my parents would ask questions to the doctor, and the doctor would be like, well, this is what the average pregnancy goes, but we don't know the answers. Every pregnancy is different. And I was always thinking that, like, why don't we know the answers? Why don't we know, like, there are some very basic things that we should know. And obviously there are more complex things that it's just hard to just, like, really investigate.
So when you moved to Boston, you were already interested in fertility? You went there to work in fertility?
Not really. It was when I moved to Boston, I think I was, like, because I did my PhD on cancer research.
Yeah.
And I was convinced that I don't want to do cancer research because I just thought that, like, what I can contribute myself is like I have unique features, and the cancer research is this very big field. Many people are doing the same things or very similar things to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And I basically decided I want to do something else.
Exactly.
And my move to Boston was fueled by that. Like I didn't want to move to another cancer lab. I didn't want to do anything on cell division. Yeah. But I want to do something different. Exactly. So that affected my choice of the place I did my postdoc degree. Yeah. And like I worked with someone who's Tim Mitchison, like that's known to be a free agent and does lots of things and very creative. And it was there when I started working with frog eggs. Yeah. So it's not again very much related to fertility, but it introduced me to the concept of eggs.
Why frog eggs?
Well, the lab was working with frog eggs, to be honest. So like I was interested in a structure.
But why do biologists use frog eggs rather than?
Oh, it's a very great question because, like, many things actually are conserved in evolution. So what the part of the frog eggs I was working with was also present in humans, but it is much easier to obtain like frog eggs than human eggs, which actually we are working with human eggs now. But then, you have to be a lot more careful. There's lots of ethical requirements that you have to respect. Yep. Also for frogs, but at the very same time, the bar is much lower for frogs.
Absolutely. And they make a lot of eggs as well.
Exactly. They make a lot of eggs. Exactly.
I liked your point about moving out of busy fields. So this is something I've always tried to do, is if you're the first person to ask a question in a field, it's much easier because it's all open. There's no one's asked questions before, or maybe no one's asked the questions for 50 years. It's an old question that people have forgotten about. Exactly. So this is something I definitely try and do scientifically, is to try and do things which other people are not doing.
You also pivoted quite a lot, right, in your career. So would you like to tell a bit about that too? Because when I first heard your name, you were doing mostly C. elegans, a worm search, and like I think now you don't work with worms a lot.
Exactly. So we used to work on. So I've always been interested in why individuals are different. Okay, so we are all different from each other, thankfully, and I've been interested in the question of where that comes from. It started off actually, so when I was a postdoc working in the UK, we were working with C. elegans, which is this tiny nematode worm. It's like about 1 millimeter long, so microscopic. But it's one of these very good examples of a model organism, so a model system that's been studied a lot in biology, and lots of important discoveries have come from it. So multiple Nobel Prizes, discoveries of lots of things which turn out to be important in humans. And the reason why we work with these model organisms is just because you can do experiments much more easily. You can ask questions and actually find the answers. Whereas if you work directly on humans, it's really hard to actually test any ideas. You can't do experiments for obvious reasons. So I was really interested in these worms and trying to understand how changes in the DNA sequence of worms affect their phenotypes. And then we noticed this thing that, as lots of other people knew, that when you have genetically identical worms, so they're like identical twins, they're not all the same, basically. So some of them are different. And in fact, if they have a change in their DNA that causes a disease, some of them get the disease and some of them don't. And this is true even, these worms with the identical genomes, and they're in a super controlled environment. So, in humans, you always say, well, this is due to the environment, what happened in your life, your family, etc. But these worms are these little things growing on a super controlled environment, and some of them die and some of them survive, and everything is controlled. And so when I started my lab, I really wanted to work on this question of like, where does this sort of differences in genetically identical individuals in the same environment come from? So it's this, the nature, the DNA is fixed, the nurture, the environment is fixed, and things are completely different. This is the kind of science that's really hard to get funded through grants. So normally as a scientist, you have to say what you're going to do, you ask the government or a charity to give you some money to do it. And normally that has to be quite safe stuff that people are interested in. And so I came to the CRG in Barcelona because we have core funding, so the institute give you money to do whatever you like, and that gives you this freedom to ask more long-term difficult questions. And so we started studying this problem of where does this variation come from, and we came up with these ideas of how it's working, and we could measure things early on and show it. Some of it is due to like chance events that happen very early in development. So after the stuff that you're interested in, the fertility, you have one cell which then develops into an embryo, into an animal. And that these very early differences, something just going slightly too high or slightly too low could then have an outcome. And that was cool. And then we've always been very lucky to have the freedom that we could just, as we stumbled on new and interesting things, we could start studying these other things. So we then started looking at where does this early variation come from? And then we started looking, well, okay, it must come from the previous generation, from the parents. And so what's different about the parents to cause this variation? And then we got closer to questions that you're interested in, because we started realizing that actually the age of the mother of these worms was actually having a huge influence on the properties of the next generation, whether they get diseases or not. But it's actually upside down from in humans. So it's the very, very young mothers who are having offspring that have all sorts of problems. And the rest is history. But now we work on very different things. So that's like biology without any genetic variation, without mutations. Whereas now we return to a problem I was interested in before, which is like, we want to know what all of the changes in DNA do. So, between my genome and your genome, there's millions of differences in the sequence. So we're mostly the same, but we still have millions of differences. And we actually still don't know in humans what most of these differences do. So we don't know which are all the changes in DNA, the mutations, which break genes and cause them not to work. We don't know. We can't predict this stuff. And technology has just changed in the last 5 to 10 years, so that we can now synthesize DNA very cheaply, and we can sequence DNA very, very cheaply. And so we can do lots of experiments where we just make hundreds of thousands of different versions of particular genes or bits of DNA, test them in the lab how well they work, and then we use sequencing to sort of count how well they work, using little evolution experiments. And it's this technology change that why we changed what we're doing in the lab, because now we can just generate these very big, very quantitative data sets where one PhD student in my lab is doing 1 million experiments. So that's the same number, and they're proper experiments where we change something and measure what happens. You change the DNA sequence and you quantify exactly what happens. And this means that one person now is doing as many experiments as the whole world was doing 10 years ago. So it's a huge acceleration in our ability to do molecular biology. The other thing that's really changed in the world is the world has got very good at artificial intelligence. Yeah. You know, ChatGPT. You know, we all use it every day now on our phones and on the internet. So we have worked out when we have very large data sets that we can train AI models from these data sets to predict what happens. Mm-hmm. And in biology, this has huge potential, but we really miss the data in biology. There aren't really big data sets for we change something, what happens. And so one thing we're trying to do in the lab now is to use this DNA synthesis and sequencing to make these very big data sets that we can then train predictive models from. So for example, one thing we're working on, which is of interest to you, is, you know, genes make proteins. The proteins are the machines that do stuff in our cells. Mm-hmm. And sometimes these proteins go wrong and they aggregate. So they come out of solution. They become, and these aggregates are the causes of many diseases in humans. So like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, most neurodegenerative diseases. You can tell us in a minute about them in the oocytes. And so now we want to find all the mutations that will make some proteins form aggregates and which ones do not, and how does this work, how we can use mutations to try and understand this process of aggregation, which is very, very hard to understand. And again, we're doing all of this in model organisms. We do it in yeast, and we do it in vitro, in test tubes. But it's because we want to understand the fundamentals of this process, because then we can work out what causes it in humans, and also how do we stop it from happening in humans. You know, this happens as we get old, and it is the cause of Alzheimer's. It's the cause of neurodegeneration. And if we want to stop this from happening, we want to work out how to treat it, we really need to understand the actual causal mechanisms of why this happens in cells. So that's like bad aggregation, but you work on aggregation which is useful, which is good at some point, no?
So no, we work with like what I like to call them is assemblies, right? Because when you call aggregate, people always think about non-specific aggregation, like non-specific coming together of proteins. And like what I would like to think that what we work with in oocytes that we found is assemblies, because they come together in a controlled manner and they dissociate in a controlled manner.
So this is an example of the choice of languages is important.
Exactly. It really makes a difference, right? Because when you say aggregates, everyone thinks about Alzheimer's disease and all those bad things. Yeah. But then there are also good assemblies inside cells that actually can be functional. Yeah. And then for some reason, it looks like the oocytes, the cells that become eggs, basically tend to have more of them. And we think it's because these egg cells are the largest cells in our bodies, basically. Yeah. Like they are about like 1,000-fold larger than a generic cell. So then maybe for some organizational matter, they have these different assemblies that they put together, and then they basically benefit them, and then after that they so
it's to protect the
exactly, to protect things.
Storage or
exactly.
Oh, that's cool.
And as you said, like, you know, when I started my lab in 2017 here, like we just started asking lots of questions on these egg cells and we use frogs as a model system. Mm-hmm. We use also mouse as a model system, and we also actually collaborate with hospitals here and fertility clinics to get the eggs, like human egg stem cells. So this way that like we can do the experiments in the model systems, and we can translate our results to human oocytes pretty quickly. Like there's something that conserves or not.
Is that an advantage of working in Spain, that you have access to human oocytes?
There is certainly a big advantage, because basically here the rules are more thoughtful, let's say, because the rules are very similar in many countries, but in Spain we can use human eggs. Yeah. It's like relatively less amount of bureaucracy. Relatively is the key word here, because of course there's lots of like ethical things that we have to do. But for example, you can't really work with human eggs in countries like Italy, Germany, France. So most of Europe, like Spain, has an advantageous position to be to actually push human fertility research. And I think it's also important to emphasize here, because I think this is something that Spain should really focus on, because they have a relative advantage because the rules are more thoughtful, but then also the average age of first mothers in Spain is the highest in Europe, and it's among the highest in the world. So it's actually Spain should put some more effort, maybe just getting this fertility and fertility treatments actually.
I see that at my son's school. The parents seem very old, basically. You know, I think I'm an old parent.
No. It's just average age in here is just for having the first birth is 33 years old. Yeah. The average age. In US, it is about 26 to 29, and in Germany and other countries, it's still lower. But here is really amongst the highest in the world, let's say. And
so in Spain, people live to be very old. The life expectancy is very high.
Exactly. But the fertile lifespan is just like not that high, right? So for example, after mid-30s, fertility decreases. And then some women actually are going to have experience very severe fertility problems after the age of 35, 36. So if you think the average age of mothers at first birth is 33. And after 35, the fertility decreases, and you need 2 people to sustain, 2 basically kids per couple to sustain a population.
Yeah.
Actually, we are really running fast into a demographic crisis in Western countries.
Is that something you worry about, that the birth rate is so low in Europe at the moment?
So it is something I worry about, and sometimes I actually talked to a couple of politicians also in Catalonia about it. And what I was surprised about is they know the stats incredibly well, meaning that they know the fertility decline coming from the local population. They know how much with immigration they have to sustain, how much immigration they should receive to have a sustainable workforce. So that was one thing that I was surprised, is that people are, especially the politicians, are very much aware of the fertility decline.
I think
Spain, and how much immigration they should allow in to make up for it in the workforce.
Yeah, I think Spain in general has quite a good attitude towards immigration.
Exactly.
We are both immigrants into Spain.
Yeah.
Have you always felt welcome here when you moved here?
So mostly, yeah. I mean, after we moved here, I felt very welcomed here in several layers, especially in day-to-day life, my kids' school and everything. But then, but I sometimes feel limited is that when it comes to higher up positions, it feels like there's a glass ceiling. That only Spaniards are allowed, and non-Spaniards are basically discouraged actively. What do you think about it?
I completely agree. I think I think this is a great place to work when you're young, and I would recommend it to anyone to come here. But I agree, there is still a glass ceiling in leadership roles, for women to some extent, but also for foreigners, foreign-born people. I don't think it's a language thing. I think it's more just a cultural attitude. That,
I guess I really didn't manage to get down to the bottom of it, but this is something, because at the beginning, if you ask me this question, for example, in my first 5-6 years here, I'd be oh, no discrimination, very open society. I love it. I still very much love it. But then the more senior I started getting, the more I started feeling there's just this distinction between where you can go and where you can't go.
But I hope it's going to change. I hope the next generation of directors of the institutes in Spain, I hope there will be lots of foreigners amongst them. If you go to the US and you look at the senior scientists in the United States, they're from all over the world.
Exactly.
If you look at the leaders of the tech companies in the US, they're also from all over the world. Half of them are immigrants. And if you look at the young scientists in Spain, it's also true. If you look at our colleagues at the CRG, they come from everywhere. We have colleagues from India, from Taiwan, from Turkey, from the UK, from the USA, and all of Europe. And we also, of course, have many Catalan and Spanish colleagues.
Exactly.
But when you look at the senior level, it's not true. It's very, very Spanish still. So it's going to take a generation to change, I think. But it's cool.
That's all. But you said also tech companies. Is it also the case in tech companies? Because you do have a tech company, right? Is it if you look at the biotech landscape in Catalonia / Spain? What do you think?
No, I think actually if you look among startup companies, the percentage of foreigners is quite high. I mean, so we have a startup company which is in Barcelona, which has been a lot of fun. And the founders one of them is Catalan, he's half Spanish, half Portuguese. One comes from South Africa, and then me from the UK. So it's fairly international. And the people who work there come from all over the place as well. And actually, I think Barcelona has been and is an amazing place for startup companies, because it's so easy to attract people to work here. It's an incredibly high quality of life city. It has a very strong brand, and especially young people, they want to come and live here. And there's also lots of talented people.
I always joke about that with my colleagues. I always say that no one wants to go, for example, Dortmund for its weather or culture, but if everyone wants to come to Barcelona because there's a culture, there's amazing number of things to do here.
It's everything is good about it. I mean, not just Barcelona, the rest of Spain as well. Madrid is also a great city, and I think it does have huge potential, but it still needs. It's really changed in the last 5 years. There's lots of startup companies here now, but it still needs to take off, and it's still a bit held back by kind of lack of investment and also a lack of confidence, I think. Like sometimes I feel that people here don't really believe that things can really happen. You know, that there could be, you know, billion-dollar companies started here from spin-outs. And it needs a little bit more confidence and a little bit more money as well. I think, you know, Spanish banks find it far too easy to make money from construction and tourism, and they need to put more of their money into high-risk stuff where most of it's going to fail, but occasionally you're going to produce Google or OpenAI. That's fun. So what are you most excited about in the lab at the moment, looking forward?
At the moment, so there are many exciting things. So we actually are, let me think. So there are two things that I will single out probably. Like one thing is that we are very excited about what do our eggs eat in the ovary. Meaning that like we do know like anorexic women or fat women have fertility problems. Yeah. But we don't really know the reason. So we do know there is like an inherent connection between fertility and diet. But like we don't know like what is the molecular basis of it. So we have some.
I mean, oocytes, eggs are amazing cells because they, you know, your eggs were made when you were a developing embryo.
Exactly.
And they've
My
been
eggs were
stored inside you for the last.
Exactly, for 3 decades, 4 decades basically. They are. So basically all the oocytes are made before we were born, right? So
do you think most people? I think most people don't know that. I think I didn't know that until I was.
Most people don't know that. Yeah, most people don't know that. So the oocytes are some of the longest-lived things in our bodies because they form before we are born, and then they remain in women until menopause. So it is really 5 decades, 6 decades, very long time span.
And biology is just so full of things like that, just like incredibly weird design. No one would ever design things like this. You know?
Exactly.
It's so complicated and so odd, a lot of biology.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So basically one thing is nutrition. So we just want to understand that, like, you know, to really break the like black box, let's say, like, you know, what is good for, like, you know, keeping eggs healthier for a longer time. And like we actually did some like insights into understanding their metabolism, meaning what do they use and what they don't use, let's say. And then
some of the questions are quite similar to, you know, things. We were talking about neurodegeneration, which is, you know, neurons are also cells which are kept alive for a long time.
Exactly.
You know, they don't divide. Yeah. And as we get old, they start to break and not work. And we don't really understand why this is. And of course, if we could find ways to keep cells healthy for longer, then this would delay or postpone or get rid of, prevent Alzheimer's.
It will increase the health span, right? So like exactly. It will like, and for example, also in the aging field, what I always feel that there's so much noise that, like, you know, there's lots of things that are extending the lifespan. Yeah. But one statistic that I really like is that, like, the maximum human lifespan hasn't really increased much. No. The average increased quite a lot. Yeah. But like the maximum is about at the same level. So that also tells us something about human biology. Like, we can increase the health span, we can make many more people live much longer, healthier. But then, you know, there's also this interesting discussion. Than as an absolute number, we can live down this current people, like, you know, it's 120 something kind of thing.
And this is something that Spain has worked out quite well, how to live a long and high quality life. I mean,
exactly.
It's one of the advantages.
I think like here we are, like, Spain's predict to take over Japan as the longest lived country in a couple of years. Yeah, exactly.
We just need to have more children, otherwise there'll be no one to support the old people.
Exactly.
That's cool. So how did you find it when you first started your lab? You go through university, you go and do a PhD, which is training how to do science. You go and do a postdoc, which is, you know, sort of independent science, and then suddenly you're by yourself. Yeah. And you have a team of people.
Yeah, it's a nice transition, right? So I enjoyed it, but then also my transition happened because it happens different for everyone, and for me it was very slow. So I was given the advice not to hire very quickly. Right, so I was in the lab alone for myself for like a couple of months, which I think I was being stupid. Like, I should have hired earlier. But then, you know, I set up the lab in the way that I wanted, and you know, I started slowly getting students. Yeah. I spent a lot of time with them, so it was like very slow, gradual pickup, basically.
Exactly. I think it's super important to get the culture in a lab right.
Yeah.
You know, different labs have different cultures, and. You know, I really like my lab to be sort of people who are excited and motivated about what they're doing and get on and are nice people. Yeah. You know, people who actually care about the work we're doing. And it's really important to get that right. And you can only get that right by recruiting the right people, by working with the right kind of people.
But that was the advice I was given, but I think it really took long, because I just also thought, like, for example, I was a young PI, so not many very good people would come to work with me.
Yeah.
So I was not advertising, for example, for postdoc positions for like almost a year. But when I advertised, there were like really good applicants that I was just like, and now they are successful. They became group leaders. Actually, one of them is starting her own lab in UB, and the other started his own lab in Germany, right? So then, I think people also should just think that, like, and if they are good, then there are going to be good applicants. So it's not that.
Absolutely. No, that's one of the most rewarding things, is when you have people who join your lab and then they leave and you see them to go on to do well afterwards. They go and start their own groups, or they go and start their own companies, and they carry on. This is definitely one of the most rewarding things of our job.
Exactly, you just become proud, right? You're just like, oh my gosh, like, this like the whole new branch of like academic science or laboratory came from my own lab. And
especially when you see people and they start off and they're not that confident. Many people are not confident, and they don't think they can be leaders, and they don't think they can ask original questions, and they grow and they can.
Exactly. Yes.
It's weird things. Like, science is not that difficult, actually. It's just there's many different ways to be a good scientist.
No, that is like 100%. I agree with you. Like, there are many different ways of being a good scientist.
Like, some scientists are very creative. Like, they ask good questions, and they think about things from different directions, and kind of have this intuitive jump as to what's correct. I can think of a few of our colleagues where they just they have the instinct as to what's likely to be correct.
And some others are kind of production machines, right? And
other
this is also
scientists
in science.
Well, you have these people who are just like incredibly efficient and get stuff done. And often in science that can be like a race, as in any industry, where it's just competition drives it, which is less fun. And then other scientists are just so focused and determined and stubborn, and they have one thing they care about, one question they're interested in, and they just keep on going at that question. And one of the really important things about science is it's mostly failure. Most of the time your ideas are wrong. Your experiments don't work.
Yes.
And you have to be able to deal with that. There's this sort of psychological thing of failing. And if you're not failing frequently, then it means you're not doing something important, because if the answer is obvious, then there's no point in doing it. That's not science.
Exactly.
So there are some scientists who are these characters who are just like incredibly determined and resilient, and they just keep going. Not necessarily the smartest people in the world, not necessarily the best people in the world, but they're absolutely determined characters. And then there's a whole bunch of scientists who are just career-driven, in it for the power and the influence, which is the worst.
Yeah, that's true. But I think, at least in academic science, I would think that they are kind of fewer than many other areas, like in terms of medicine or like finance or something. Like in the end, you just don't go into science saying that, like, oh, I'm going to have the best career out of it, like that.
There are easier ways to make lots of money, and there are easier ways to be powerful and influential.
It's just like, I think many people like don't really grasp though how fun doing science is. As in, like, because you're asking the questions that you care about, like really learning the answers, or on the way failing quite a lot, getting the answer. But like, it is really fun just if you like enjoy what you do, and like
this thing of continuously thinking about things we don't understand and struggling with the unknown is, it's one of the most rewarding things you can actually spend our time. Not everything about being a scientist is good. There's lots of really annoying administrative stuff we have to do. But at the end of the day, we basically, as our job, we get to have a hobby. That's it. Our job is a hobby. We're asking questions, and we're doing things which we're interested in, which is an enormous privilege.
But it's also very hard to explain to other people, right? For example, I have other friends, and they are just like, for example, this is like a bank holiday. And they were like, what are you doing in this bank holiday? And I'm just like, well, I just want to do a couple of things in the lab, and I just want to write a couple of emails. And they're like, why? Why do you do that? I'm just like, well, actually, I would like to do this in my free time, because I just I'm curious what's going to happen in the long run. And then I think one thing what people don't really realize is also, like, as scientists, we also have lots of freedom to manage our time. Meaning that, like, I can work on a full holiday because I'm very curious about something that I want to answer as soon as possible. But then, like, maybe a couple of weeks later, I can just like take a Wednesday off and like kind of do something more relaxing, and so that like I can manage my own time rather than just being stuck with this like 9-to-5 work schedule, for example.
Exactly. There's a lot more freedom, and I guess it's similar in a lot of creative jobs. If you're a writer or
exactly
sculptor, or you make films, you know, it's fun. You're doing something creative. And I think the creative aspect of science is hugely underappreciated. You know, many of the best scientists are super creative people. You know, you're coming up with ideas and big jumps of reasoning. Also this kind of the sort of beauty thing, because, you know, a lot of science is like suddenly seeing simplicity from something that seems complicated. It's sort of chiseling away at a problem. And then you suddenly see that like something that seemed very, very confusing and uncertain and complicated, suddenly it all makes sense. It lines up, and you can understand it. Some sort of principle comes out.
And also just as part of it, you can help humanity. Like literally, you can help humanity.
Yeah, exactly.
If you saw like some of these like protein folding problems of a neurodegenerative protein, or like if you saw some of the aspects of female fertility, then like you do what you like. You just like, you know, spend your time working in this thing, and then but you find your findings can help not just you or your immediate circle, but really you just like make a huge advance for everyone's lives. That's also like a big picture motivate things step for everyone.
Yeah. And I completely love it when you're working on something and you're only doing it because you think it's an interesting question. It's like a very basic question. And then about halfway through doing it, you suddenly realize like, this is actually really relevant for this completely different thing that I wasn't thinking about. And or this, you know, you suddenly realize there's like a huge potential clinical implication of what you're doing, or that the method you're developing could be used not to study yeast or worms or whatever we're doing, but could be used in humans. I really like that. Like, for example, AlloX, which is this biotech company that we started in Barcelona, you know, that sounds like it makes a lot of sense. You know, that we started doing something because we wanted to do this thing to be able to map drug binding sites on proteins. That's not true at all. We started developing those techniques for a completely different reason. We had no idea, no intention of the outcome. And it was only about halfway through that we realized that, this would actually allow us to do something which would be very useful for drug development. There was never any plan to do that. And there was I never wrote a grant to do it. I never asked anyone whether we should do it. And I don't think we would have done it if we had been constrained in that way.
But this non-linear fashion of science, though, is really like misunderstood, I would say.
Exactly.
Especially by politicians, because when they come like for funding schemes, they're saying that, like, okay, we want to improve clinical research. You can't improve clinical research by saying that you will improve it. I think it's just more like you have to have a bottoms-up approach, that you have to create a landscape that like people are going to be working on many different problems. And then some of them are going to turn into more translational clinical applications, and some are not.
Sometimes just like it's doing more good science rather than more applied science, because you know, if you look at the history of science, particularly biology, you know, most of the fundamental insights have come from people working in very basic, simple systems where it's easy to ask questions and you get definitive answers, no answers. And people trying to work on more clinically relevant stuff, human stuff, it's very difficult because the experiments are difficult, the answers are not always clear, there's lots of confounding factors. And, you know, one principle we've always had is to try and do things in the simplest system where you can study the problem. You know, the very simplest system, you get rid of all the other complications. And that's really helped me over the years, and I think it's really helped biology in general over the years.
Of course.
Do things where you can actually ask the questions and get answers to those questions, and then go and apply the understanding towards human biology and medicine.
I think so.
And if you go back and you trace where the fundamental new drugs come from, where do new therapies come from, there's always this long history of going right back through very obscure, weird research that people were doing that led to unexpected outcomes.
But I think this feeds back into the complexity of biology, right?
Yeah.
Because like if you talk to, for example, engineers, because like there's an engineering system, and like you do know that like you can develop systems and you can add on. And many people think biology that way. And unfortunately, or fortunately, like, you know, depends on the point of view, biology is way more complex. It's not that your understanding one bit now means you're gonna like linearly add up to that understanding and reach an end result. You're just gonna adopt something, and you're gonna go back 2-3 steps, and there's gonna be something more complex feeding into what you learned, and then it's much more slower.
This is touching on something that I'm super interested in at the moment, which is how do we make biology easier to engineer? How do we make it so that it's easier to engineer biology, so that we can at the moment it's embarrassingly how bad we are at designing and engineering things in biology. If you want to make a protein to do one particular thing, or if you want to make a cell to change its behavior, we're so bad at that. It's so embarrassing. And there's no fundamental reason why we shouldn't be able to do that. And why can't we engineer biology like we can engineer software?
We don't know enough of the complexity, right? We have to learn a lot more to be able to engineer, because that is how the engineering part comes from.
Yeah, exactly. So it is more complex. There's more variables, and this is why I think actually machine learning, artificial intelligence is going to be super useful in biology, because there you can build really complicated models that are just predictive. You don't have to necessarily understand how those models are working, generating. Artificial intelligence, generative videos and speech and self-driving cars. This hasn't come from people understanding how things work. It's come from just training models. And so I think a lot of this is going to replace a lot of medicine and a lot of biology of just having huge amounts of data and then training models from this data. Okay. And we won't necessarily understand it to start with. And I think that's going to be the sort of second phase, is when we start trying to understand how these models work and replace the models with just very complicated, millions of parameters, neural networks, to simplify that, distill it down into simpler models where we actually understand how it's working and we can test, is our understanding correct?
But I think that we have to emphasize it's going to take a long time. So it's not going to happen in the next 5 years kind of thing, though.
Yeah, but it's super exciting at the moment. It's the ability to study biology now is so much better, more than it was 20 years ago when I started.
Because also there are many more methods to study, like much smaller sample size. And so what did it mean for you to get the Fundación Banco Sabadell Award?
I liked it because it's like, you move to a country and you work there, and then you get this recognition from the country for what you've been doing. So it made me feel at home, actually, and appreciated. You look at the other winners, and it's nice to have your name amongst these other people. I think it's also nice that there is a bank which is supporting biology. This is symbolic. This is how it should be in the world. There should be more foundations and more private individuals supporting science in Spain. What about for you?
No, I completely agree. First of all, it increases the visibility of both you and your science, right? So you just earn that page with lots of other people that are very renowned and big scientists. So it is nice to be there. And also it is really nice that a bank gets out of its way and to help fund science, and also I think some other social activities, because not many banks do that, and I think they really should just pay more attention to science and increasing scientific awareness in the society, what people do, what actually people in this country are doing and contributing to this international effort.
It's true. I mean, we're just young and small, but there are really good scientists working in Spain, and most people don't know this. You have famous football players, you have famous chefs,
exactly.
You have famous politicians, unfortunately. But nobody can name scientists in Spain, and there is good science going on here, and people need to feel proud of that. At the end of the day, most of it is paid for by the government, by the taxpayers, and so people should know about it, and they should be proud of it.
I completely agree, and they should be proud of it. I think that is the main thing, because the Spanish science funding is not that high compared to other nations, other European nations, if you think about it. But then, there's really good amount of good level of science coming out of Spain, and people should be really proud of it. Also the efficiency of the scientists here. So
exactly, it's a very good use of money. Spanish science funding is very efficient, very productive for how much money. What comes out for how much money goes in is actually remarkably good. Could be more, absolutely.
Exactly, they could certainly do it more. So I think also the banks' efforts is also Sabadell's efforts are also.
And also in the medium term, the more good science there is in the country, the more startup companies there are going to be, and the more it's going to create wealth and jobs and change the economy. You only have to look at where in the world are all the big tech companies. They're all in Boston in the United States and California. And it's why is that? Because those are the places that invest the most money in science and the most money in basic science. That's the important thing. So therefore they attract the best scientists and they train the best scientists, and these scientists stay there. They all stay in Boston, they all stay in California, and they start the companies there. They don't go home. And Spain could absolutely be like this, it is one of the best places to live in Europe. So
Exactly. I
people
agree.
will move here and they will start companies if they can.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This was a very lovely chat.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Exactly the same.
It's interesting to actually talk about the bits behind science rather than just the science.
Yourself. I completely agree. Yeah. That was lovely.
Should do this more often.
Yeah.